They laughed. Inside one of America's most elite foreign policy forums, a room full of diplomats and economists erupted in laughter. The joke that Canada had turned Trump's trade war into an investment strategy, but what they were laughing at should terrify every American. At the same time, South Korea issued a chilling warning that U.S. demands could trigger a financial collapse worse than 1997. These aren't just frustrated allies. They're building a future without Washington, quietly, methodically, and with zero apologies. This isn't about tariffs, it's about the moment America's closest friends decided to leave. And once you see how deep this rupture goes, you'll realize the world isn't waiting for the U.S. anymore. The setting was almost too perfect. Inside one of New York's most prestigious foreign policy gatherings, packed with diplomats, economists, and defense insiders, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took the stage. Calm, poised, and deliberate, he wasn't there to start a fight. He was there to deliver a message. But when the punchline landed, it wasn't just clever. It was a knife wrapped in velvet. He said, with perfect timing, Trump's tariffs did more to push Canada closer to Europe than any Canadian Prime Minister could have dreamed of. The room exploded in laughter, but behind the humor was something far more dangerous than a joke. This wasn't a roast. It was a quiet, calculated humiliation, and it worked. Carney wasn't just making light of America's failed trade war. He was exposing the deeper truth. America's threats backfired, and Canada used them as fuel. For years, the U.S. had relied on Canada as a loyal, quiet junior partner, reliable, dependent, always in America's shadow. But that era is over. Trump's aggressive America First strategy didn't scare Ottawa. It liberated them. It forced Canadian leaders to ask a question they hadn't asked in decades. What if we didn't need the U.S. anymore? The answer came quickly and decisively. Carney walked the room through Canada's transformation. In just a few short months, Ottawa had signed one of the most ambitious trade agreements in history with the European Union, not just access to markets, but integration into Europe's financial, economic, and even defense structures. Canada wasn't hedging its bets, it was rewiring its entire global position. Carney made it clear Canada would no longer rely on Washington's permission, protection, or political stability. And the most brutal part? He did it all with a smile. No shouting, no finger pointing, just cool, professional detachment, as if to say, we've already moved on. He even joked that Trump's chaos had done more to unify Canada's global strategy than any internal policy could. But the laughter wasn't the real moment. The real moment was the silence afterward, the realization that Canada isn't just reacting to America's decline, it's preparing to lead without it. That laugh was more than a jab at failed tariffs. It was the sound of a door closing, a quiet but undeniable shift from partnership to independence. While Canada dismantled U.S. leadership with a smirk, South Korea went for something far more direct, a diplomatic sledgehammer disguised as a warning. In an interview with Reuters, South Korean President Lee Jung didn't hold back. He did something allies almost never do. He publicly compared America's demands to the financial collapse that nearly destroyed his country in 1997. It wasn't a veiled concern. It was a red alert. At the heart of the crisis, a massive $350 billion investment deal. Washington's proposal was simple. South Korea would front the cash, but America would control every single dollar with no financial safeguards, no shared oversight, and zero long-term guarantees. The funds would flow directly into U.S. infrastructure and tech programs, with spending decisions made unilaterally in Washington. It wasn't a partnership. It was a take-it-or-leave-it ransom. President Lee's response was icy and precise. He warned that complying with such reckless terms could plunge South Korea back into the kind of chaos that defined the 1997 Asian financial crisis, a time of shuttered factories, mass unemployment, and families losing their entire savings overnight. His message was clear. This deal could collapse our economy, and we're not going to let that happen. What made Lee's words even more shocking was the context. South Korea isn't just another trade partner. It's one of America's most loyal allies, home to over 28,000 U.S. troops, a critical buffer against North Korean aggression and a cornerstone of the U.S. presence in East Asia. And yet here they were, standing publicly in defiance, saying, "We'll risk instability over submission." And behind that decision was a deeper realization. America wasn't offering protection anymore. It was using financial dominance as a weapon. The idea that Washington could demand hundreds of billions from an ally without safeguards while holding all the power wasn't just audacious, it was dangerous. For Seoul, the message was personal. The proposed deal didn't just threaten the economy, it insulted the decades of trust and cooperation built between the two nations. It said, in effect, "You exist to serve our interests now." And South Korea responded with its own message: "We're not your ATM, and we're not going to crash our economy for your politics." If the investment demands pushed South Korea to the edge, what happened next shoved them straight over. In Georgia, at a Hyundai battery plant, one of the largest South Korean investments on U.S. soil, more than 300 South Korean workers were suddenly detained. Many were shackled, paraded in handcuffs, lined up like criminals, and within hours, the images were all over Korean media. The outrage was instant. The symbolism was unavoidable. This wasn't just a workplace raid. This wasn't a paperwork mistake. This was a public spectacle. And it happened while Seoul was in the middle of deciding whether to trust Washington with the largest investment deal in its history. President Lee tried to contain the fallout. He publicly insisted that he didn't believe the raid was ordered by Trump himself. He blamed it on overzealous officials trying to diffuse the rage back home. Washington scrambled to apologize. Leaks suggested Trump was furious, not at the arrests, but at the timing. Offers were made to let the workers stay, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Because here's the brutal truth. You don't put your allies' citizens in chains while asking for $350 billion. To South Koreans, this wasn't about immigration enforcement. It was about humiliation. It was a reminder, loud and visual, that even decades of loyalty mean nothing when the U.S. decides to flex its power. And the fact that this humiliation came at the exact moment Seoul was weighing a deal that could reshape its entire economic future, that wasn't seen as coincidence. That was seen as disrespect. Inside Seoul, officials were furious. But more importantly, they were shaken. Because if this is how America treats its allies during negotiations, what happens after the deal is signed? If South Korean engineers and specialists can be handcuffed in the middle of a diplomatic negotiation, what kind of leverage does Seoul really have? And while this diplomatic firestorm raged, the American response came across as tone-deaf. Some U.S. officials pointed out that Japan had accepted similar trade terms. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick even said publicly that Seoul should follow Tokyo's example. But South Korea's leadership didn't hear guidance. They heard dismissal. As if their economic vulnerability, their political risk, their unique position didn't matter. The chain reaction had begun. And it wasn't just policy that broke, it was trust. While Washington was busy managing chaos at home and burning bridges abroad, Canada was quietly building a strategy, not to confront the U.S., but to outgrow it. And the man leading the charge, Mark Carney, former central banker, now prime minister, and the architect of what could be one of the most significant geopolitical realignments in North American history. Carney laid it out clearly, almost clinically, in that now infamous Foreign Policy Forum speech. He didn't need to raise his voice, he just presented the facts. 3 pillars, 1 goal, total independence. Pillar 1, build strength at home. Carney didn't just talk about spending more, he talked about transformation. Canada is on track to double its defense spending by 2030, tearing down long-standing internal trade barriers between provinces and pouring billions into advanced technology. AI, quantum computing, clean energy, critical minerals. Carney's message was simple. We're done being America's tech farm. And here came the coldest line of the night. Unfortunately, Carney said, Most of our top AI and quantum talent ends up in the US, but since you're tightening your visa rules, we'll be keeping more of it at home. It was said with a smirk, but it hit like a thunderclap. Canada had been fueling America's innovation engine for years, and now that engine is running low on imports. Pillar 2, diversify abroad. Carney wasn't just building at home, he was wiring Canada into a global network that doesn't revolve around Washington. The landmark trade pact with the European Union wasn't just about goods and services, it included defense and financial integration. Carney even confirmed that Canada is on track to become a full member of SAFE, Europe's Strategic Defense Initiative, and it didn't stop there. Canada has now launched a comprehensive economic framework with Mexico, deepening bilateral ties to create an alternate trade triangle, one that can operate independently of American leadership. Quietly, methodically, Canada is pulling its closest neighbors into a new orbit. Pillar 3, defend values. While America tears itself apart in political dysfunction and social division, Carney framed Canada as a beacon of stability, a pluralistic society, functioning democracy, unified leadership, sustainability as a core value. It wasn't just a speech, it was a declaration of succession. If America won't lead the free world, Canada is stepping into the vacuum without saying it outright. And through it all, Carney never attacked. He didn't have to. He let the facts speak for themselves. This wasn't rebellion. This was replacement. Behind the headlines and sound bites, there's a quieter, more dangerous game being played, and South Korea just exposed it. During the height of negotiations with Washington, Seoul made a simple request, a currency swap agreement. On paper, it's a technical tool. In reality, it's a financial lifeline, one that can mean the difference between stability and collapse. Currency swaps allow two countries' central banks to exchange funds directly, bypassing volatile private markets in times of crisis. For South Korea, it would provide access to US dollars if their financial system came under pressure, a real possibility if they agreed to Trump's demand for a $350 billion outflow. With that much capital leaving their economy, Seoul's reserves could be drained, triggering panic and devaluation, just like in 1997. But the U.S. refused. No explanation, no negotiation, just a firm no. That single word revealed something far more dangerous than trade friction. It showed how America has come to rely on the dollar not just as a currency, but as a weapon. When allies like South Korea face economic uncertainty, Washington can choose to give them breathing room or tighten the leash. And in this case, they tightened it until Seoul nearly choked. The message was unmistakable. Give us the money, accept our terms, and hope we don't let your economy burn. No safeguards, no backstops, no trust, just raw pressure. South Korea's leadership was stunned. They weren't asking for charity. They were asking for the same mechanism other trusted allies already have. Japan, for instance, has an active currency swap line with the US. Their economy enjoys a cushion. South Korea? Nothing. And so Seoul did the unthinkable. They began forging swap agreements with other countries, bypassing the Federal Reserve entirely, quiet deals with other central banks, contingency planning, backup routes. In short, an escape hatch from the dollar empire. This isn't just a financial strategy, it's a political earthquake. One of America's closest military and economic partners is actively building alternatives to U.S. financial leadership. Not in protest, not as a threat, but because they no longer believe Washington will act in their best interest when it matters most. The implications are massive. The power of the dollar has always been one of America's strongest tools, a silent enforcer of global dominance. But when your own allies start insulating themselves from it, the foundation begins to crack. As tensions escalated, U.S. officials tried to downplay South Korea's concerns. The message from Washington was clear: just do what Japan did. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick even went on record suggesting that Seoul should simply follow Tokyo's example. The problem? South Korea isn't Japan. not economically, not politically, not financially, and pretending otherwise only made things worse. Japan holds over twice South Korea's foreign exchange reserves, enjoys a much stronger global currency, and, crucially, already has a currency swap line with the US that means Tokyo can take bigger financial risks without fearing a liquidity crisis. They have backup, they have options, and they have the kind of trust from Washington that Seoul was clearly being denied. But instead of acknowledging these differences, the U.S. attempted to apply a one-size-fits-all policy, expecting South Korea to swallow the same deal, with none of the protections. For Seoul, this wasn't just tone-deaf, it was insulting. To South Korean leadership, it felt like Washington wasn't treating them as an equal partner, or even as an ally. They were being treated like a cash machine, expected to hand over hundreds of billions with no input, no safeguards, and no respect for the unique economic risks involved. Behind closed doors, South Korean officials were livid. The idea that they should accept identical terms to a country with vastly more resources and a completely different strategic position wasn't just unfair, it was reckless. Worse, it sent a message that America wasn't really negotiating, it was dictating. The attempted copy-paste approach blew up in Washington's face. Instead of pressuring Seoul into compliance, it pushed them further away. It made it clear that America wasn't listening, it was commanding. And this wasn't just a diplomatic failure, it was a strategic miscalculation, because unlike Japan, South Korea was already on edge, financially vulnerable, politically cautious, and now publicly humiliated. By refusing to see the difference, the U.S. proved it wasn't interested in partnership, only in power. This moment shattered whatever was left of Seoul's trust in Washington. They realized they weren't being treated as a valued ally, but as a convenient asset. And the backlash wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was cold, calculated, and final. There were no slamming fists, no dramatic ultimatums, no headlines screaming, "Break up." But make no mistake, what happened that week marked the quiet collapse of two of America's closest alliances, and the final blows came wrapped not in fury, but in diplomacy. Mark Carney's speech didn't end with threats or condemnation. It ended with something far more unsettling: confidence, not in America, but in Canada, in its institutions, its people, its direction. He painted a picture of a country that wasn't just managing global chaos, it was rising above it. He spoke of pluralism, of functioning democracy, of national unity despite deep diversity. He reminded the room that Canada had not only survived America's protectionist pivot, it had thrived because of it. And he didn't need to say it outright. We're the grown-ups now. And then, on the other side of the world, President Lee delivered a closing line that barely made headlines, but will haunt Washington for years. Between blood allies, he said, we will be able to maintain the minimum amount of rationality. On the surface, it sounds like diplomacy, cool, measured, almost reassuring, but look deeper, and it's something far more chilling. Minimum amount of rationality doesn't mean harmony, it doesn't mean trust, it doesn't even mean partnership, it means barely avoiding collapse, it means the relationship still exists, but only in name. This wasn't a threat, it was a diagnosis. South Korea isn't planning to burn bridges, but they're done pretending that Washington still deserves the benefit of the doubt. The alliance may live on in treaties and talking points, but behind the scenes, the foundation is already cracking. Together, Carney and Lee delivered a 1-2 punch that U.S. leadership never saw coming. One made the case that Canada no longer needs American leadership. The other made it clear that South Korea no longer trusts it. And here's what makes this moment different from any past dispute. There's no desire to fix it, no rush to get back to the table, just a cold, methodical shift toward independence. Washington may still hold the paperwork. The alliances may still be official, but the message is out. The world is no longer waiting. America's closest friends have moved from frustration to resignation, from disagreement to detachment. While Washington fumbles alliances and alienates longtime partners, Beijing is playing the long game and winning. As America's closest allies begin to question their loyalty, China isn't lecturing, threatening, or demanding. It's simply waiting and quietly building a world that doesn't need the U.S. at the center. For over a decade, China has been laying the groundwork for parallel financial and trade systems designed to bypass U.S. influence. From launching its own version of SWIFT through CIPS to settling trade in yuan instead of dollars, Beijing has offered something simple and powerful to its neighbors: options. And now, as South Korea stares down what it sees as American economic blackmail, those options are starting to look like lifelines. Seoul's rejection of the $350 billion U.S. deal isn't just a blow to Washington's ego, it's a potential turning point in East Asia. Because while the U.S. demands unchecked financial control, China is offering regional inclusion through agreements like the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's the largest trade bloc in the world, covering nearly a third of global GDP, and the U.S. isn't part of it. By pushing its allies into corners, America is doing exactly what China couldn't do alone, driving them straight into Beijing's sphere of influence. And here's what makes it even more dangerous. These aren't ideological decisions. South Korea isn't suddenly embracing China's politics. Neither is Canada, nor Mexico, nor any of the others starting to drift. These are pragmatic survival choices. When the U.S. starts acting like a liability, nations start asking, what's our backup plan? And China has that backup plan ready to go. It's not just RCEP. It's new bilateral currency swaps with dozens of nations. It's infrastructure funding through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's digital payment systems that don't rely on Visa or MasterCard. Slowly, methodically, China is offering an exit door from the dollar-dominated system, and more countries are walking through it. The more Washington weaponizes its influence through tariffs, sanctions, immigration raids, or financial pressure, the more attractive, neutral, no-strings-attached partnerships start to look. And Beijing isn't rushing. It doesn't need to. Every time America overreaches, China gains ground without lifting a finger. By now, tensions between South Korea and Washington had reached a boiling point. But instead of recalibrating, the U.S. doubled down and made a crucial miscalculation. American officials, trying to downplay Seoul's concerns, offered a simple solution: just do what Japan did. On paper, it sounded reasonable, but in reality, it exposed how little Washington understood the situation and how disconnected it had become from the dynamics on the ground. Japan and South Korea might share regional proximity, but economically, they're on completely different playing fields. Japan holds over twice South Korea's foreign exchange reserves. Its currency, the yen, is considered a globally liquid safe haven asset. Most importantly, Japan already has a long-standing currency swap agreement with the U.S., providing a built-in safety net if markets begin to panic. South Korea, on the other hand, had none of those luxuries. Its financial cushion is thinner, its currency less globally accepted, and, as Washington made painfully clear, no currency swap lifeline. Yet the U.S. expected Seoul to accept the same deal with the same terms, despite the vastly different risk factors. To South Korea, this wasn't just unfair, it was reckless. It signaled that the U.S. wasn't negotiating in good faith. Instead of treating Seoul as a strategic partner, Washington was copy-pasting foreign policy, as if allies were interchangeable. The deeper message? Your unique challenges don't matter, just sign the deal. That was the final straw. Inside South Korea's National Assembly, lawmakers began openly questioning the integrity of the alliance. Economists warned that copying Japan's terms without Japan's financial advantages could destabilize South Korea's economy. Public sentiment shifted, not just against the deal, but against the idea of relying too heavily on America at all. What Washington saw as pragmatism, Seoul saw as exploitation. The U.S. wasn't asking for cooperation. It was demanding obedience. and the attempt to present a complex, high-risk financial demand as something routine or standard was not only disrespectful, it was dangerous. South Korea got the message loud and clear. America doesn't see an ally, it sees an ATM, and that's when everything shifted. Mark Carney didn't raise his voice, he didn't rant, didn't accuse, and never once used the phrase American decline. But by the end of his now viral speech, the message was unmistakable. Canada is no longer waiting for the United States. It's building something bigger, and it's building it without Washington. His address wasn't just a clever critique of failed U.S. trade policies, it was a blueprint for a new global order, one where Canada no longer plays second fiddle, but instead leads as part of a new coalition of stable, values-driven democracies. Carney laid out, piece by piece, how Canada is realigning its economy, military, and foreign policy, not around the U.S., but around a wider global vision. At the heart of that strategy is what insiders are now calling the third pillar, a new power bloc that isn't caught in the tug-of-war between U.S. hegemony and rising authoritarian regimes. Instead, Canada positions itself as a bridge between Western liberal values and the multipolar reality of the 21st century. Carney didn't just talk trade, he emphasized defense integration with Europe, technological alignment with Asia, and economic diversification with partners like Mexico and the EU. The message was clear. Canada is building resilience, and it's doing it by connecting with everyone except Washington. And perhaps the most powerful part of his speech? What he didn't say. He never once referred to the U.S. as a central piece of Canada's future. Not even in passing, not in trade, not in defense, not in diplomacy. It was a glaring omission, and entirely deliberate, because Carney wasn't opposing the United States. He wasn't even criticizing it directly. He was doing something far more symbolic. He was moving past it. This wasn't defiance, it was evolution. Canada isn't breaking up with America, it's simply outgrowing the relationship. It's quietly stepping into the leadership void the U.S. once filled, and doing so with calm, capable confidence. For Washington, that silence should be deafening. Because when your oldest ally no longer includes you in their vision of the future, you're not just being criticized, you're being written out of the story. The world is quietly shifting, not in headlines, but in actions that change everything. So tell us in the comments, which ally do you think will walk away next, and who's already gone? If you haven't seen our last video, it connects all the dots. Don't miss it. And if you value the research, time, and truth we put into every story, support us with one click. Subscribe now.